Great, thank you for the nice introduction, Gerald. Good afternoon, everybody. As Gerald said, my name is Dave Murray, 95 graduate of Ag Business. I actually started my educational endeavors here as part of the School of Ag, but in Natural Resources Management Forestry. When I first came into Cal Poly, I wanted to be a forest ranger and I wanted to be out in the woods and do that kind of thing in the mountains. And after the first quarter at that point, maybe the second quarter, I changed my major to Ag Business. And at that point in time, my sole goal in life was just to be outside. I wanted to be one of those guys driving around in a lettuce field in Salinas in a white pickup truck and jeans and boots and do that for a living, right? That was the next best thing to being a forest ranger, except I could do it for the private sector. So did my time at Cal Poly, graduated, and I had two job offers when I finished. One was to work in wine grapes up in the Napa Valley area, and the other was to work in strawberries along the Central Coast. And I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it was just because I was familiar with the area. I chose the Central Coast route, and I went to work the Monday after my last final in working in strawberries, and started out in an entry-level role, and quickly, based on need of the organization I was with, I got to be a strawberry farmer at a very young age, and I had direction from the person that I worked for, and they said, it's real simple, just go figure it out, surround yourself with good people, and don't lose the money. And so that was my guidance at that point, and it kind of set me off on a trajectory of learning about all kinds of different things, right? And when you start the early stages of your career, you always have some level of technical, or you're going to work in some technical area of the business, whatever business that might be. And over time, after you've mastered that and you show that maybe you have some other attributes of your personality, of your skill set that qualify you to be a leader, because people are kind of attracted to your style, and you have the ability to facilitate discussions and maybe connect the dots between disparate areas of the business. You show people that are within the organization that you work for that you can do that, and all of a sudden you start to rise up, right? And you can do more, and you become a farmer where you started out being a farmer of one area. Now you're managing 3 or 4 areas, and all of a sudden you're managing multiple countries, so on and so forth. And that's just how it happens, right? And it happens quickly. Not that hard to separate yourself out from everybody else if you have the work ethic and the ambition, right? It isn't today, and it wasn't back then. So 2004, there was a group of us that worked for that company that I went to work for right out of school, and we started our own business, and that was a farming company and a sales company in California that then merged with another company that is now Good Farms. One company had the Mexico piece, we had the California piece. Now we're a multinational company that does business in the US, 3 districts in California, throughout Mexico, 4 or 5 districts in Mexico, and we're also doing some stuff in Colombia. So it's a diverse business. We grow strawberries along with other commodities, and we do some vegetables, some cucumbers, tomatoes, raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, and so forth. And we sell to the big, large retailers in the US, the Costco's, Walmart's, also Panera Bread and Chick-fil-A and McDonald's and others too. So we have a big business. We have a lot of product. We probably produce about 20 million units of product, however you define that, 8 pounds of strawberries a year. And as you can imagine, there's fruit that's packed by us and grown by us under our standards. Any day of the year, it's out in the marketplace. You can find it in any grocery store, depending on where we are at that point in time throughout the US. And we're providing food to people, right? And that's one of the things that we can never forget as a farming organization, that we're not just farming to farm, we're farming to produce food for humans to eat, right? And it's a really important distinction, because for some of the reasons I'll get into, sometimes that, if you forget that, or you lose track of it, or you don't have all your procedures in place to make sure that the food that you're providing people is safe and wholesome, it can get you into trouble. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened in my case. So let me ahead of myself a little bit on this next slide. But as you go through the years in business, I've been doing this for about 28 years, and you see all kinds of different things, right? That's what experience gains you. And Sometimes that experience is good and sometimes it isn't so good. And I've had the misfortune, but the fortune in terms of learning to go through several crises in my career, some of which are involving labor, right? They could be labor union disruption, labor strikes. I've been involved in those. I've had situations where I've had 400 angry people around me and I'm having to come up with an answer. That happened very early in my career, maybe 2-3 years after I graduated, right? And you learn real quick how to speak Spanish, and you learn real quick how to negotiate and talk with people and meet them on their level and understand that everybody's just trying to figure out how we solve a problem, and you learn the mistakes that you made and how to make it better the next time. So that was an example of a crisis that I went through and extracted myself out and our organization out of. We've had issues with fires, down in Ventura County or throughout this. Ventura County is mostly where we have the bad fires because of the Santa Anas. Ash blowing around where people are trying to work in fields, and it creates breathing problems and it creates vision problems and eye irritation, and people don't like to work in the field in that instance, and you'll get labor advocacy groups and others that'll be involved, and media can be involved, and you've got to navigate that whole thing. And whether that turns out to be a crisis or maybe an issue that I'll go into the distinction, that has to be defined, but these are things that can be disruptive to your business, right? And I've had, unfortunately, a lot of experience with it, with the biggest being a major food safety outbreak that I had to manage back in 2016 that was involving some of our cucumbers that I think made about 400 or 500 people sick, and 3 or 4 people died during that food safety outbreak that was caused by products that we distributed, right? And so that was an example of a major crisis that we had to manage and deal with and extract ourselves out from and be better off because we had gone through it. So what I want to do today, and I'll kind of use that as a backdrop and some of these other instances as a backdrop for going through some slides that I have for you. There are a lot of slides. We may be able to get through all of them, we may not, but I want to try to provide you a backdrop on when you're a corporation or anything, they're trying to manage a crisis. There's a process that you go through, right? It's not something that you just do haphazardly. There's a proven process that will get you to where you want to be, which is the end result, and better off because of it quicker. And so I want to go through some of that. Some of these slides are a little funky because they narrate, but I want to make the distinction between a crisis and an issue, right, or a critical issue. A crisis would be something that has an immediate disruption to your business, right? Our food safety outbreak 2016 with the cucumbers, the FDA is calling us saying your product is about ready to be implicated in a major food safety outbreak in the United States. It's going to be announced to the world. We have to manage customers. We have to manage employees. We have to manage the media. We have to be prepared for that. We have to have our website up in order. We have to be on social media, and it has to happen quickly, right? Back in 2016, it was a Friday afternoon, and usually these things happen when you're at something like this, right? When your mind's totally engaged with something else, you'll have a crisis pop up. It's just Murphy's Law. It happens every time. Or it'll happen on a holiday or a Sunday or whatever the case. We got a call from the FDA saying this was going to happen, and we had to be prepared. They were going to launch a posting on their website within the hour, and we had to get very quickly prepared to tackle that with our customers primarily, but with the public. We were going to have CNN calling us and wanting an interview because it was a big deal. Up to that point, it was one of the most, I would say, most widespread food safety issues up to that point in the United States history, right? And that was just our little company that was involved in it. That's the example, the best example I can give of a crisis. And it took us years to extract ourselves from that, right? When you're talking about issues management, those are little things that pop up. Those can be, for example, a customer that was disgruntled with your products that posts on their social media blog about how dissatisfied they were with what you did, right? It's a small issue, but if that person is a major influencer or it starts to connect with others, it can turn into something bigger. And so you need to be watching for that type of stuff, and you may have to manage it because it could turn into a major crisis if you're not careful and it doesn't get the attention that it should. That's the distinction. when you break this down into subcategories, what are we talking about, right? You have a perceived crisis or a perceived issue, which is, a video or a photo that gets posted on social media or someone's website. An allegation could be a consumer or somebody that says that you did something when maybe you did or maybe you didn't, but it's an allegation, especially if that person's a credible source. Again, this day and age, it doesn't have to be true, it just has to be posted or it has to be said, and it may be something that you're going to have to give some attention to and manage. Could be a bubbling problem. You may have some labor unrest. You may have an issue where maybe it's community unrest. We farm in some areas of Mexico where there's an issue with some of the public infrastructure, right, with schools and roadways and other things. And so sometimes there's some unrest in the community that can be disruptive as they block roadways, and protesters can cause problems in that way. And right, so we have to resolve those issues because they could have an unintended impact to our business, and they could start out small and become bigger. You could have unpredictable crises like COVID. Right, COVID came about. We didn't know if it was going to shut down our business. We didn't know if there was going to be a major disruption. We had to work through all that. Luckily, ag was exempt and we were able to move through it, but it did cost us a lot of money in trying to put a lot of the procedures in place that we needed to, like any other business, to operate effectively. So it was, I would say, more of a financial crisis as it turned out, but it could have been much more. Good example. Then you have the rapid escalation, which is, again, a major food safety outbreak, a labor strike, something that's hugely disruptive to your business immediately. You really have two objectives when you're talking about managing a crisis. First and foremost, you're trying to protect your brand and your reputation, right? Among your key constituents, which are your customers, your employees, your owners, of which I'm one, but you have to manage all of these different stakeholders, and your main job is to protect those two attributes of your business, because they can cost you a lot of money, and your reputation in the marketplace is why people decide to purchase your products at the end of the day. In which case you're trying to lower the financial impact of what you face. When we had our cucumber issue in 2016, it probably cost us $10 or $12 million, right? And it was a very, more importantly than that, it was a very unfortunate situation where people were made to be sick and some died. It was hugely, much more important than the financial aspect. But the way I approached it was, we can't learn from it and continue to do good, to be a good actor in the space, right, by learning these lessons that we thought we were doing right in the first place, if we're out of business. So we extracted ourselves from it. We're a better company because of it, and we continue to do good. But had we had a huge financial impact and weren't insured properly, we hadn't managed it properly, I wouldn't be here talking to you today in this capacity. What you're really trying to do at the basic level is trying to manage a crisis in this way, right? You need to identify and understand that it's a crisis in the first place. You've got to know by being aware of your surroundings, and then you're trying to contain it, right? How can you minimize the impact? How can you mitigate the issue? How do you get to the end of it as fast as you possibly can in the least amount of pain possible? And then you want to resolve it, right? As you mitigate and you solve these and get through it, how do you resolve it? How do you become a better company because of it? How do you then get to the fourth category, which is to rebuild? How do you become better? How do you learn the lessons and move on? And I feel that's what we've become in every instance. And I would say every crisis that I've ever been through, we've learned lessons that have made us better. Really 6 parts to the issues that you have to focus on when you're managing a crisis. Again, know your vulnerabilities. We produce products that people eat. We know we're vulnerable if we're not careful and we don't have the correct food safety practices in place. We know we employ 10,000 people. We know that if there's a problem somewhere and we don't have that resolved with our workforce, it can create a huge issue for us. We need those people every single day out in the field to produce the products that we grow. Know your strengths, right? Know what kind of company you are. Be aware of what you do right and also what you do wrong. We were very dedicated to food safety when we had our issue. We thought we were the best in the industry, and I still think we were. But these issues can still happen, right? There's still weak points. And those are the things that are going to get you, the things that you're not watching. Thirdly, you need to make sure that you manage an effective messaging platform to your key audience, like I said, right? Make sure that you can write this stuff. Make sure that you're prepared in it. Make sure you have your messaging platform set for different scenarios that can come about. Very hard to do this stuff at the last minute, so you want to be prepared and have a good plan. You want to understand what your current events are. What are the issues out in the world? Who's trying to attack an industry, or who's got the microphone? Who is raising an issue that may pertain to your business and be a threat to your business? Read, understand, watch the news, be aware of what's happening, because it may affect you or it may boil and have a spillover effect. You always want to anticipate what's going to happen next, right? As you're walking through this process, understand that something could start out small. Understand that when step A happens, typically step B and C are going to happen. You have a major food safety outbreak, for example. The next thing you can guarantee is you're going to have legal issues with those who are made ill by lawyers coming in, and they're going to want to sue you, and they're going to want to collect money for those that were harmed, right? Fair thing to do, but you've got to protect yourself against that as well through insurance or other means. And you should also be prepared to act fast, right? When we had our issue, it was immediate. We had to do it right away. Everything else drops. That's the thing about a crisis. When you have it happen to you, everything else that you're working on takes a back seat. And for me, it was like a 2-year period, right? We had to stop working on everything we were working on and manage that, because that was the threat of the day.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Talk about effective messaging
Uh-huh.
to key audiences. What is an example of that for business?
Typically, so the question was, when you talk about effective messaging, what does that look like, right? In our organization, I'm typically the one that's in charge of managing the crisis, right? I'm the lead guy. Part of that is because I have somewhat of a skill set in it. Part of it is because I have a skill set because I was trained in it. I've had a lot of media training. And I'll walk through some of that on what good looks like in terms of media training. But typically what you want to do is, I call it being humble, right? When we had our issue, you have to admit that there was a problem. You have to be humble about it, and you have to say that, look, we're not as perfect. We know we're not as perfect as we think we are. Sometimes simply saying you're sorry, right? I mean, there were people in our case that were made sick and some died. We're sorry. That's a strong word, and it resonates with people. We didn't mean to do that. We thought we had good processes in place, and unfortunately it happened, but we'll be a better company because of it after coming out. So humility is important. Being clear in your messaging. I'll walk through some of the other issues. You don't want to be negative, and you don't want to come off as a whiner, right? We're sorry that this happened to us, poor us. That's not the kind of thing that you want to do when you're speaking to the public. And so there's some tricks that you want to, and I wouldn't say tricks, but there's some things that you want to do to make sure that your message is clear and concise, right? Media training is a really important part of that, both in written and verbal and on stage form, right? Yeah.
Yeah, what are some things that you need to plan ahead, within that 24 to 48 hour period, once you have a crisis?
If you hold that for a little bit, I'll get into some of that. Yeah, it's really your crisis management plan and how you need to have that. I didn't know this back, when I was earlier on in my career. I didn't understand that you needed to have this, but you really want to have a crisis management plan developed. So a lot of these questions are pre-developed, right? So you have them in a binder, you have them in a file, and you practice this stuff. It's like a fire drill of sorts. Yeah. Already talked about this slide? Yeah. Some of these slides I'm going to move through just to get through a little faster, but one of the things that's important to understand is that sometimes, as a company, you realize that you're just at risk, right? And we produce food. We have a lot of product out in any one day of the year, and we produce it in an environment that's in the open, and we don't have a kill step. In other words, it's not a jar of strawberry jam that's heated, that's basically shelf stable. These are products that we don't have a kill step, right? So if you don't have the correct food safety practices in place, the risk is there to make people sick, right? And so you have to understand, as a fresh produce producer, as we are, there's an inherent risk with that. And so we know that we have a vulnerability, and so the way you mitigate it is through having solid standard operating procedures so you can create as safe a food as you possibly can, according to all the research that's been done. To answer your question, the way you minimize a lot of this is to have a good plan, right? And we go through that exercise every year and make sure everybody understands what their role is and their job in the process and who needs to be contacted and so forth. As a business, you need to know what your strengths are, right? What do you do right? We spend a lot of time on people development. We spend a lot of time on social responsibility efforts, right, in the communities that we operate and also our workforce. We spend a lot of time giving them a voice and setting up opportunities for them to give us input on how we can run our business better. All of those sorts of things are mitigation measures that you can use against, a crisis involving even food safety, right? If you have people that understand what they're there to do and they're producing food and harvesting for consumers, that goes a long way towards minimizing food safety issues in the future. You're not going to have a lot of labor unrest if you're engaged with your workforce, right? So we feel like our people are our strongest, our biggest asset and our strongest support group. Your brand is important. Do you, even if you've had crises in the past, did you extract yourself well from it? Are you a better operator? Are you a better actor in the marketplace because of it? Do you have a reputation of running a good show? Are you innovative? Are you paying attention to the details? All of those sort of things give you a good reputation with consumers and retailers. It's important. Quality of your products, kind of the same thing. Do you produce a good strawberry? Do you have good relationships with regulators, right? I spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. with the the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. I want to have relationships with those people in the unfortunate chance that maybe we have a crisis in the future. I want to make sure I know who to call to get the answers I need in order to get ourselves on the right track as soon as possible, right? So those relationships that you build, state agencies, federal agencies, they're all extremely important. And you're always working to do that, right? Trade associations, there are experts that work for our trade associations that may be able to answer a specific question for you, because it's a team. When you're managing a crisis, it's a team of people, usually with a lead. I'm on the board of directors for the Center for Produce Safety, which does a lot of research around food safety issues for fresh produce. We're a founding member of the Equitable Food Initiative, which is an organization that involves the United Farm Workers Union and Cierto and Oxfam, typically organizations that are anti-agriculture, that we're now hand in hand with trying to develop better systems for agriculture. We don't do it for that reason, but they do provide mitigation measures against these things happening in the future, because again, now they're with us. They know the policies and procedures we have in place, and they'll be our brand ambassadors moving forward. Again, who's your key? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Could you go into different organizations and what you mean by anti-agriculture? Can you delve into
Sure.
that a little bit more?
Yeah, so when I first started in agriculture, it was very common. It was kind of the tail end of it, but it was very common for labor unrest. It was a period of time when there was a lot of labor unrest for different reasons. But there's an organization that they're technically a labor union, but they're really kind of a social cause. It's called the United Farm Workers Union, if you've ever learned about Cesar Chavez. He was an important figure in the labor movement, even an important figure in agriculture, right? There was a time when you'd look back and before my time, where people weren't treated that good that worked in fields. And there was a labor union that was started via Cesar Chavez that kind of started this movement around trying to correct that. And they became a labor union, and for different reasons, they along with others would sometimes cause disruption. Anytime you're trying to organize through collective bargaining a group of people, it can be a little bit disruptive, right? Because not everybody wants to do it, and certainly the employer doesn't, and so it can cause a problem. That's one example. It could be a labor union or a labor advocacy group that is saying bad things about your industry or your company. It could be groups that are anti-pesticide use. We're in agriculture, right? When you're growing, we're probably the largest organic strawberry grower there is, but we also grow conventional and we use pesticides. And there are people out there that don't want any pesticides used, but they're a tool that we have and it's legal to use, and for right, wrong, or indifferent. So they can be disruptive. Really kind of revolving around those two general groups: environmental concerns, labor advocacy groups. And typically we have always looked at them as kind of anti-ag, and they're not the ones that we want to engage with, the enemy of sorts, right? We kind of changed our mindset some years ago, and we said, why don't we start to engage with them? And why don't we try to bring them in closer to us and help, if they're complaining about things, why don't we work with them to correct those injustices, right? Whatever they are. And so we started a conversation, and really what it ended up being was an auditable, in our case it was an auditable procedure called the Equitable Food Initiative, where we have those groups as part of it, and you submit yourself to an audit that then verifies that you are the company that you say you are, right? And a big part of that is creating some working groups with the people that are in your fields that have input, like I said, into your policies and practices. So times are changing. You don't see as much of that anymore. You don't see as much, kind of confrontational behavior, but it can still be out there. It can still be there, and you can still have disruption because of it, and you've got to manage it accordingly. Yeah. Okay. You can take a look at this list. I mean, who are your key audience? Who's your key audience list when you have a crisis, right? It's the media, your customers, your employees. Sometimes it can be local residents if you have an issue that's local. Regulators, certainly, because you have the FDA to deal with and the Center for Disease Control, and also activist groups and elected officials. These things can kind of boil sometimes, and they can take on a life of their own, and you need to be ready to adjust and adapt. What is journalism today, right? What is there? Is it really news that's edited and looked at in terms of valid facts, or is it more show business? Is it about trying to, is Fox News or CNN, or are they really just trying to back up your own opinion and create noise, right? I don't know. You could debate that, but it's certainly changed from when I was younger, where you had news and the facts were checked, and it was more of a kind of a process that you could depend on. Now it's a little more sensationalized, right? And like I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be true, it just needs to be posted, and it can still cause you problems. But most, you still have the issue of having reporters and people that want to get a story, and that's still an active part of our space, and they have to be respected because they're part of it, right? And they want your thoughts and about the who, what, when, and how, right? When an issue arises. Sometimes it's not a crisis. Sometimes they just want to know what you know, and they want you to speak on something because they think you're a social or you're a subject matter expert. But even that, if you provide some goodwill to the media, sometimes that can even help you because you have relationships with a lot of those folks as well. What's the objective when you're dealing with the media and you're trying to, the reason I'm going to go into some of this around the media piece is because it's a very important part of crisis management, because when you're a food producer and you're a company that produces products and you have a problem, the media is going to be part of it, and that's the scariest part, right? I mean, I've had CNN with a camera in my face, and you have to be practiced and you have to be ready, because it's one thing if you're in the written, if you're written in the written world in terms of responding via email. It's another thing if you have to do a media interview on national television. That's a scary thing to do, and the only way that you reduce the fear is by being prepared, right? But it's an opportunity to tell your story. Have you ever, watched a a 60 Minutes piece or anything on CNN where it looks like a politician isn't even answering the question that was asked, that's on purpose. They look very polished on purpose. There's a saying that says, your question is irrelevant to my answer. And that's a concept within media training that's very important to understand, because there's a lot of truth in that, right? You're asking me questions. I have my platform prepared. It doesn't matter what you ask. I'm going to be able to tell you the story that I want to tell you, and that's the key to it all, right? It's being prepared and having. In my case, it was having people help me learn to do that. Now I know how to do it pretty well, but back then I didn't, and so you have training and you learn these things over time. You want to steer the way it goes. You want to tell your story. Sometimes people say, I'm going to shy away from the media, no comment, right? Wrong answer, because if you don't tell the story, if you don't talk about what happened, somebody else will. And it's going to be a lawyer, it's going to be the advocacy groups, it's going to be a disgruntled employee, it's going to be somebody who is made ill, it's going to be a labor union organizer, whoever it is, but you want to take that opportunity. It's an important part of you telling your story so you can extract yourself from the situation and turn it in the direction that you want it to go. The key with talking to the media, and I get into this because I think it's interesting and fun, but I could go into a whole thing around media training and how you do it appropriately. I'm trying to kind of cover the high points here, but really what you want to do is you have one main point. What is your one main message that you want to portray? And then you have 3 subpoints beyond that, and that's really all you need. You can tell that story a bunch of different ways, but what is your main point that you're trying to convey, right? In our case, back in 2016, it was that we understand we have a problem, and we're going to do everything we can as fast as we can to fix it, and we're sorry. We're sorry that this happened, and we're sorry for the people that were made ill by our products, right? That was the main point, and then we went through the 3 subpoints of what does that mean? It was that simple. And over and over and over again, we told the same thing in maybe a slightly different way. Call it that rule of 3. This is an example you can read real quick around, let's use the example of worker safety, right? These are your 3 points that you're trying to convey. They're very concise. It gets to where you want to be. It's well written. You want to spend some time working on this because words do matter, right? The written word is important, and then you read this 500 times and you can say it in your sleep. I have some other examples, I think, but I want to get through this. Just some rules of thumb as you walk through some of these different forms of crisis. Again, a lot of times it's going to be around either labor, because that's a big thing in our business at least, or it's going to be around product quality or food safety, having made people ill. Whenever you're talking about a food safety outbreak or a recall, it's always about the consumer, it's always about the customer, it's always about their well-being and public health, always, right? You don't talk about yourself. You talk about what you're doing to fix it so it doesn't happen again. Whenever you're talking about labor unrest or labor issues, it's always about the workforce. It's always about the people in the field. It's never about you. Pretty common sense, really, but sometimes not so much. Again, I'm sorry resonates. It's human, right? Be empathetic to people that were made ill, to people that were part of the labor unrest, or that maybe your company did something they didn't know they did, and you have a problem with your workforce. Own it. Know that you need to you need to make sure that you explain the fact that you're taking steps to fix the problem, and ask yourself, if I was in their shoes, what would I want to know? What do I want more information on? What do I want this company to do? Anytime you're providing messaging to the outside public, it's always an opportunity for you to communicate who you are, what you're about, It's an opportunity for you to tell your story. You might get an opportunity to give one little tagline in an interview. You may say, you may talk for 10 minutes and they may only give you 2 sentences, right? So make sure your words count, make sure your speech is concise, make sure your messaging is on point, make sure that you have thought through this because you may only get one chance. They decide what they print, not you, but make sure you're leaving them with some important information that sound good in sentence form. It's okay to have passion. You know, some of us have more than others. It's okay to be excited, but anytime you're dealing with a crisis and talking to your constituents, whether it be your employees or the outside world or the media, don't show frustration, don't show anger, don't show the fact that you're annoyed even though you may be, right? You're representing your organization, you're representing your company. It's important to be like this, right? It's probably one of the reasons why I'm the one in our company that does it, because you're never going to see me be way up here or way down here. It's kind of like this all the time, right? And that's an important attribute, important skill set to have when you're dealing with a crisis. You need to slow the game down because it's going to move awful fast on you, and so you have to be able to be calm and walk through it. These are kind of fun examples of, I'll show you some examples of good quotes and bad quotes. This is an example of a good one that was involved. These are real quotes involving a listeria outbreak on fresh produce. And I'll let you read that. Talks about consumers, talks about families, talks about the fact that you're an owner in the company and a mom. These are all things that are meant to elicit a kind of a response out of people that makes them know that you're human, right? Take responsibility for it. H2A housing, you can have issues there too, right? Now that we're recruiting a lot of people in foreign countries to come work in the fields in California, you're housing people, which opens up a whole nother issue and a whole nother responsibility, and you can have issues with that. We haven't, but it can happen. But it kind of follows the same path, right? You're taking some responsibility, you're being humble, making it human, talking about them, not you. This one's good because it's mine. While we recognize that our actions cannot alleviate the pain caused by a victim's suffering or worse, the loss of a loved one, we promise that we will learn from this experience. When we find the problem, we will fix it and take every step possible to keep it from happening again. Responsibility, accountability, and the fact that you're going to fix it. And we did. We came out of this much, much better than we went into it in terms of our accountability and what we do to try to find pathogens in our fresh produce, right? That was the big difference. We weren't looking for this stuff. We do now because I want to know it's there, because if I can find it, I can deal with it. I don't want to know after it's made a bunch of people sick, that's for sure, right? Back when you guys were all young, there was a major oil spill off an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. And the CEO of BP said this, and it goes down as one of the worst quotes of all time in terms of crisis management, because it came over to the public like he was whining, right? And when we're getting trained on this stuff and I talk about it, I always use this example because this was a Fortune 100 company, and this guy made a huge error in terms of the way that he took responsibility for the crisis, right? And it didn't bode well for him or his company. Nobody likes a whiner, remember that. Another example, Alec Baldwin, right? Another one. These are things you don't want to say, right? This is what happens when you're not trained and you let your emotion get the best of you. You can imagine what the media is going to do with something like this, right? And you could argue the media, this day and age, it's over 5 minutes after they post it, but still, this stuff can take on a life of its own. Do you want to Do you want to be seen as someone saying this, or do you want to say what was said by others that provide a good example? Another one, heat illness, right? Yeah, but this isn't something that you want to do. This was somebody in our industry that provided this quote, right? Bad one. You can also bring in experts, right? And you want to allow experts to become part of your team. You want to have that preset. You want to make sure that you know who your lawyer is and your labor expert and your elected officials, certainly your customers, right? You want to bring them in as your advocates. In our case, when we had this issue, many of our customers had been through our operations and helped us develop our food safety practices. So when this happened, they knew that we had solid practices in place. So we didn't lose any business because of this happening, right? We lost nothing because we had so much goodwill built up with our customers. And that was hard to do. But we had paved the road, we had paved the way for that many years prior, and it really helped extract us from the situation faster because of the goodwill that we had built. Be aware of your surroundings. Are there things brewing out there that could play a role? Or, did something happen in a field somewhere that's loosely related to you, to your organization, that could bubble over and start to create spin around everything that happens in your industry that you're a member of? Be aware of that stuff because it could have a spillover effect, and be prepared. What are current hot button issues, right? Was there something that came out about pesticide use, and it may be a pesticide that you use, and what are you going to do about that, right? Did you have a question?
I'm just curious, so what would you say are some hot button issues in the strawberry industry that you kind of watch out for?
I would say recruiting workers from foreign countries to come live in communities here. That can be a hot button issue, right? We need people to come up here and work. Some people don't like that. Some people don't like it because they feel like they're offsetting American jobs. Some people don't like it because they don't like masses of people living in their community that aren't from there, right? There's all kinds of different reasons, and you've got to manage that. That could be one. Could be that there was an issue with strawberries. Just recently, there was a hepatitis A issue with frozen strawberries. Even though it was isolated to a certain farm in a certain country, that could have a spillover effect if you're not careful to your entire industry, because people don't really pay attention. They see strawberries, hepatitis A. Do they take the time to really read about the fact that it was isolated, or do they try to say that it's all strawberries everywhere? Those things can happen. People's attention span is very short, and they can cause problems. A couple of examples. Some more examples, somebody died in a field because of heat illness in a strawberry field. Again, do they try to, put that across an entire industry? Does the media try to blow it up? Do labor advocacy groups try to blow it up? Who knows? Sometimes it can be nothing and blow up into something much bigger. Sometimes the legislature gets a hold of it. California state legislature, it's politics, right? So they want to have a hearing. You could be in front of a panel of legislators at the federal level, at the state level, talking about why your industry is so messed up. It's not, but it's kind of bubbled up into that. So these kind of things can happen, all kinds of threats. You had asked a question. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to ask, are there any examples of lawsuits, like with strawberries, for you guys?
None with us, but so use the hepatitis A issue. Last spring, there was a hepatitis A outbreak on fresh strawberries from one distributor on 2 or 3 farms coming from Mexico. This is an area that we grow in as well, and they were on organic strawberries. They made some people sick. I don't remember the statistics. The people that were made sick, I can promise you they sued the distributor that sold those strawberries, right? Because it's the way it works. It's like anything. You have lawyers that are out there, and in our space, there's one in particular. His name is Bill Marler, and he's an expert. He's an expert attorney suing companies that have made people ill. He's made a career out of it, and he's usually the one that, with people that were hospitalized, he'll pick up 2 or 3 different clients and sue the company. Typically, your insurance is going to cover it if you have it, but what if you had to recall product and you had to bring it back in? It could cost you millions of dollars in that regard as well, right? So lawsuits are just part of it. They happen all the time. You can be sued by employees for, being hurt or wrongfully terminated. There's all kinds of things that can happen, right? As much as you try to guard against that stuff, legal issues are part of the space.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any lawsuits like if somebody dies in the field and like due to a heat.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
do those families like pursue a lawsuit?
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
the company?
Yeah. 100% of the time. Yeah. And you can imagine why. In many cases, it's understandable, right? When you're on the other side of it, it's not that much fun, but yeah. I mean, somebody died, they're gonna, and you were working somewhere, that's gonna happen. And it's understandable. Yeah.
And I'm assuming that it's a tough battle, like, that they go through, or?
Surprisingly, when you deal with civil lawsuits and you're dealing with issues revolving around harm and product liability, it's almost like a matrix, and I've learned this over the years, where you'd think it's a big battle, but a protracted legal issue costs a lot of money on both sides, and typically you're dealing with expensive legal fees on those that are suing, the company that harmed you, and the company that harmed you has insurance that then has to hire lawyers to defend them, right? Because they're indemnifying you in large part, but they have attorneys. But they also know those attorneys are expensive. So most of the time, it's like a matrix. It's this happened, this is what it's going to get settled for, and that's it. And both lawyers know what that is, and it just happens real quick most of the time. Sounds a little strange, but that's kind of the way it's efficient in that way, right? So the family or the group that was harmed, they're getting money, and it just ratchets up depending on the severity of it. And you're going to pay, as you should. If you harmed somebody or you did something wrong, it's the cost of doing business. And I'm a big fan of, being responsible for your own actions. And sometimes that's the way things have to go, right? It has to hurt a little for you to get better. Last point, one of the biggest things you can do to mitigate against, well, you can't really mitigate the problem itself, but you can certainly reduce the time that it takes to get to step 4 in that little chart that I showed you, which is coming out of it, right? Better is having a good crisis management plan. And so we went through that process several years ago as we came through our cucumber issue and developed a very in-depth crisis management plan that outlines who does what, who's going to manage your social media, who's going to manage your website, who's going to create your messaging, who are your consultants, who's your attorney, who are the customers you need to contact, what are the emergency phone numbers. Everybody has a role. You know who your experts are. You have preset messaging platforms, right? So you have one ready for 80% of it's done for food safety, 80% of it's done for a labor problem, 80% of it's done for H2A housing. And you take that and use it as a baseline for what you need to do so you're not starting from zero. We learned a lot. We didn't have 2016, we were still using 1-800 number, right? Or somebody was calling a receptionist at the front desk. That really isn't the case anymore, but you have to be prepared for that stuff because you're going to get inundated with phone calls. You're pulling back product. People want to know if they ate product that was contaminated, right? You're gonna have hundreds of phone calls a day, and you need to be ready for it. You need to quickly get a hold of your customers. Who are they? Who calls them? What do you say? A lot of that stuff can be pre-scripted, so you're prepared for it, and you just have to tweak it at the very end. So we go through that. A lot of companies don't. But those who have gone through it before do, because they understand that it can happen, likely will. It's just part of doing business, unfortunately. That's it. I got through more or less on time. I can answer any questions you have. Anything caught your interest or that you want to unpack a little bit further?
Let's thank Dave for.
Yeah, thank you.
Questions.
I was wondering, so in class we've learned that whenever something like this happens, you can pretty much track it back to the field or the tray or
Uh-huh.
like something like that where it came from, because people get sick in like one general area. So I'm guessing you guys did that, and then once you figured out where it came from, what did you say to the people that worked there predominantly?
So in our case, I'll give you the breakdown. We still don't really know what happened, but the answer for the most part is yes. A lot of times, this is the concept of traceability, and you'd like to think that you could bring it back to the single box level. But most of the time, just out of an abundance of caution, if you are going to implicate a field or something, you're going to cast a really wide net. Unless you know for sure that it came from one specific place, you're going to probably cast a wide net, right, to be safe. But if you did know that, in our case, we knew it was one grower, because it was the only grower that was growing cucumbers for us at that time, and there was one packing shed, right? And we think what happened, this isn't really the answer to your question, but it's interesting. We think what happened is the salmonella got in somehow. Salmonella lives in the environment. It can be in the water. It's here, it's there, it's everywhere. And you have to look for it. Salmonella got into that packing shed somehow, and we think it got into the roller brushes or some hollow rollers that were the fruit with the cucumbers were running over the top of. And the hollow rollers, they can get leakage inside and create a biofilm. And then that biofilm can leak back out if you're not cleaning them properly, right? They're hard to get to. And we think that, even though they sanitized everything every night, there was this leakage that was happening, and it was kind of running through the whole process. And again, we sampled some. We sample a lot more now because we want to know it's there. But we didn't see it, so we were running product for 30 days. So 30 days worth of product went out into the market. And that's why it was so pervasive and widespread. But when that happened, you can imagine people feel terrible about the fact that they were working there. The grower feels terrible. They have to work through it. But like anything, you say, look, there's nothing we can do about it now except what we can do, right? And let's learn from it. Let's try to understand what happened, and let's be better having gone through this. And I went through a period of probably a year where I was doing a lot of this, presenting to different groups and trade associations, because at that time it was a big deal, and part of our process was to share the message on what our experience was, right? So we could turn a negative into a positive if that's possible, and I think it is in most cases. Yeah.
In the aftermath of something like the foodborne illness breakout,
Uh-huh.
is it hard? Does it really impact the distribution of will people want your product in the future? As well as insurance companies, will they want to insure you afterwards? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It can. It can. It can affect the whole industry. Again, if all of a sudden people think that what you want to have happen in our country, we have a wonderful epidemiological service, right? And it came as a result of 9/11. Where the government wanted to make sure they had a mechanism in place to identify pathogens, because at that point they thought there was going to be, one of the ways that you could create terrorism is by contaminating the food supply, right? So they created this system that county health departments, when people go in and they have illness and they have reason to believe it's food poisoning, they draw blood. And then that blood goes into a database and they do a genetic fingerprint on it. And when product is sampled through state agencies or the FDA as it comes across the border in the case of Mexico, and they find a hit, they'll test for salmonella or other things, they're going to genetic fingerprint that. And they're going to match the two, and it's really easy and it works extremely well, and we're lucky to live in a country where that's possible, unless it's your product, right? And then you have to deal with it. But that's what good looks like. Back in the day, before we had that, they would say, all strawberries from Mexico contaminated. And it shuts down a complete industry, and it's extremely difficult to extract yourself from that. What you want to have happen, even if it's you, is to identify exactly where the point source was, even when it's you, because that it's going to come back around another time, and you want it to be isolated to one farm, one company, right? Because it can be hugely disruptive if it doesn't. But even when it does, it can, if you don't do it right, it can create a situation where nobody wants to buy your products. And a lot of that can happen by the way that you're admitting to fault. Admitting to fault is probably the wrong word for legal reasons, but admitting to the fact that you could be better. And it's important that you do that in order to protect your brand and your reputation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the aftermath of the crisis, were you asked to do anything differently? I know you mentioned the rollers and how you were doing more samples and more testing.
Right.
But were you asked to switch them out or use a different procedure, or did you just have free reign over what happens after?
No, well, you do, but what's going to happen is the FDA is going to come into your facility and they're going to give you their report on what they think the root cause was, right? And then you may or may not agree with that. You need to fix what they say because they're the federal government. But you're also going to, in our case, we surrounded ourselves with world experts in this stuff. And we said, tell us what we need to do. What is it we need to do to fix this? And so we're not experts in it. We don't know how to do it, obviously, because it happened. So you bring in the best minds and have them walk through a process. And again, one of the things was just to look for it, to figure out where it is, and if we find it, then we can stop it immediately. Even if it means that you found it, now you need to bring back product. That's still better than having it go out for 30 days and making a bunch of people sick. So a lot of processes, a lot of, those hollow rollers, we have sets of them now that we can change out and sanitize on the inside. A lot more sampling. People are more aware. So.
Another question?
What else?
You answered both of my questions.
Uh-oh.
Does everybody know that all these foodborne illnesses, that the pathogens that are involved, Listeria, Salmonella? Everybody heard these before? Okay.
Yeah. They're out there, and they happen. It happens all the time if you watch, if you see what's happening in lettuce, strawberries. Lettuce has Listeria a lot of time, bag salad, Listeria. Grows in drains, and it can splash up onto surfaces, and it's a scary one, right? There's more lettuce being processed into salad now and mixed with a bunch of other stuff and put into your bag. Nobody really buys a head of lettuce so much anymore, right? But it's all processed, and we don't irradiate this stuff. We don't cook it. It doesn't have a kill step, so the only thing that you have to guard against making people sick are just good, solid practices, right? Sanitation practices and sampling, such.
Have you ever had a situation where you felt like the regulatory agency was wrong in what they were trying to? They're trying to get to the bottom of the cause of a problem.
Yeah.
And they might identify a place or an organization or a brand. Has there ever been a case where the place or the brand was erroneously blamed, and then they found out otherwise later, and they had to back it up or walk it back, I should say?
Yeah, the agencies that do this, they're just like everybody else. They're not perfect. They don't always react to it as well as they should. But the FDA's job is public health. CDC's job is public health. It's not company health. Their first role is to protect the public, right? So they're always going to err on the side of caution. But when you go through these, and the reason why you need to have contacts within these organizations is the first thing you do is ask, what information do you have that says that what you're saying is true? Show me. And even that sometimes is hard to get, right? But you just keep asking, and you try to put pressure on them in a respectful way, so they have to tell you why it is they're going to do what they're about to do. And sometimes it could be that they're going to cast a wide net, right? The hepatitis issue in Mexico, there was a company that was implicated in that. We had sold one load of product to this competitor, of our product to this competitor that was implicated in the issue. Because of that, we were going to get brought into this same thing and say it was going to be said that our label was also implicated in hepatitis. We said, what information do you have besides the fact that we were related through that method? What epidemiology do you have? Blood samples, genetic fingerprint? What other information besides we were just guilty by association that will allow you to bring our product into this, right? Because we didn't want that, as you can imagine. We pushed back and we were able to get that stopped because they didn't have enough data, right? They didn't have enough data to do that. And it was important, and that's another good lesson is there's nothing wrong with having, a healthy line of questioning for regulators, because their job is public health. So if it's easy and they're just going to cast a wide net, that's what they're going to do, but it can be hugely disruptive to your business. And you don't want to let them do that unless it's true. Certainly you have public health first and foremost as well. I mean, I'm a consumer. My family eats products as well. I don't want to diminish the importance of that, but let's base it on good data and not just someone wanting to be overly cautious, right?
I see some other.
Yeah, Shishiga.
Sorry, I missed the first part. I was wondering if you talked about MRS, how
Yep.
how you're testing for that and how you take decisions based on that.
Yeah, so question is, how do we manage MRLs? An MRL is in essence the allowable amount in parts per million, parts per billion in some cases, of a certain compound that you can have on your product. And so every crop, in our case strawberries, conventional strawberries, there are EPA limits that are set for different compounds that are pesticides in essence, right? And they're based on the formulation is based on how many different products would a person eat over the course of their lifetime to cause exposure, and so they allocate a certain amount towards strawberries and bananas and other things, right? So let's say the Captan is a important fungicide for us, and let's say the limit is 5 parts per million. You're limited to that, right? And everything that in terms of how the product is used, it's typically based on data that tells you that over a certain period of time, if you pick it a day later, it will have dissipated, right? And we have good data and we have good experience with that, but you have to verify and validate. So we do monthly sampling of all of our operations, right? It's an expensive sampling, but what you want to do when you're managing a sampling process is use a risk analysis, right? So sometimes if you start out here or here in your sampling, over time, as you recognize that, hey, I'm not having any experience, I'm not having any hits for this specific water source or this specific farm or whatever the case, you can start to reduce that amount, right? On organics, we do it a lot because the downside of having a pesticide residue on organics is big, right? That's consumer confident. We can't have it. So we do a lot more on that front.
Yeah, I had a question about the sampling. Sampling for salmonella, at the site, what does that involve? Is that like a quick screen? And if there is a positive, does that typically lead to a voluntary recall, or how's that usually handled?
So typically the way you do it is you sample the environment for salmonella. You kind of start at where it can come from. Usually it's water. Typically that's the most prevalent source, and you'll sample that. And if you find that there's an issue, then you'll do an immediate remediation of that source, and you'll stop using it until you know that you've remediated it. But anything, if that water came in contact with anything, because a lot of times maybe it's a tomato plant that grows up like this and you're irrigating with drip irrigation, you're like, well, there's no problem because it didn't touch the fruit. Yeah, but what if you're using it for fertilizer applications or sprays, right? So you have to dig into that some and understand your process. So then you'll kind of work up from there, right? You may not test for the pathogen. Sometimes you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to test for the pathogen itself at first, partly because if you do that, you're in a test and hold scenario. So we harvest strawberries the next day. They're being shipped out and on into the market because they're so perishable. If you test for a pathogen, you need to hold that product in your control until you get the result back. Because what if it comes back positive? Now you need to recall it, right? You want to make sure you have control until you know it's negative for sure. Sometimes you'll use a marker. There are different methods by which you can test for a marker, and if that marker comes back clean, then you know you don't need to test for the pathogen. If the marker comes back positive, well, now you need to dig in deeper, right? So there's some different things that you can do. There's some legalities involved. There's some strategy, but you're looking for it nonetheless, right? You're looking for it, and you want to spend a lot more time. The regulations don't require you to do that, but you as a company should, because then you can do something about it. At least we think that way.
All right, everybody, thank you, Dave, again.
Thank you.